They did not begin by breaking bodies. They began by breaking identity. When we talk about slavery, we often imagine chains, whips, and forced labor. But long before physical punishment, there was a quieter weapon, one designed to humiliate, confuse, and erase what it meant to be a man. Across plantations in the American South, black boys and men were deliberately denied the symbols of adulthood. They were dressed like children, stripped at choice, and publicly exposed to shame not by accident, but by design. Clothing became a tool of control. Not because fabric mattered, but because meaning did. In the 19th century, what a person wore signaled who they were in society. Child or adult, dependent or independent, powerless or respected. Slaveholders understood this deeply. By forcing black males to remain dressed in childlike garments well into adolescence and adulthood, they sent a clear message: you are not a man, and you will never be treated as one. This was not about economy. It was about dominance. Imagine growing strong enough to work from sunrise to sunset, yet being denied recognition as an adult. Imagine your body maturing while society insists you remain invisible as a man. This constant contradiction carved deep psychological wounds that history rarely names, and textbooks almost never explain. Tonight, we are looking into that hidden history. Not to shock but to understand. Not to sensationalize but to reveal how power truly operated. Because once we understand how identity was weaponized, we begin to see slavery not only as forced labor, but as systematic psychological warfare. Before we continue, take a moment to support this channel. If stories like this matter to you, stories that uncover overlooked truths, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these conversations alive. Now, let us begin at the place where control started, not with chains, but with humiliation. What began as humiliation in childhood did not end when black boys grew taller, stronger, or more capable. As their bodies changed, the rules imposed on them did not. Many carried the same childlike garments into adolescence and adulthood, walking through plantation yards with the strength of men, but the outward markers of childhood still clinging to them. This contradiction was not incidental. It was a carefully maintained system meant to blur the line between boyhood and manhood, ensuring that maturity did not lead to autonomy. In the world of the plantation, recognition mattered as much as labor. To be seen as a man meant being acknowledged as someone with agency, desire, and authority over one's own body. Slaveholders worked deliberately to prevent that recognition from ever taking root. By keeping adult males dressed in garments associated with children, they denied them the social signals that announced adulthood, signaling to everyone enslaved and free alike that these men were not entitled to the respect normally granted to grown males. Over time, this denial shaped how others treated them, but more devastatingly, it shaped how they learned to see themselves. As adolescence arrived, many of these young men were expected to perform the hardest labor on the plantation. Lifting, hauling, building, and enduring long hours under the sun. Their physical strength was exploited without hesitation, yet their emerging identities were held in suspension. They were men in responsibility but children in appearance, a dissonance that followed them through every interaction. When they stood among others, their clothing announced submission before they ever spoke, quietly reinforcing the hierarchy that ruled their lives. This prolonged infantilization carried profound psychological consequences. Identity does not develop in isolation. It forms through recognition, reflection, and the way one is seen by others. When society consistently refuses to acknowledge someone as an adult, that refusal becomes internalized. Many enslaved men grew up without ever being allowed to step fully into manhood in the public sense, even as they felt its pressures privately. Desire, pride, ambition, and self-worth existed within them, but there was no safe space for those feelings to be affirmed. The damage went beyond embarrassment. Being denied visible markers of adulthood created an environment where self-doubt could quietly take root. Some learned to suppress outward expressions of confidence to avoid punishment, while others carried a persistent sense of unease. Unsure where they stood within the rigid social order, the message was reinforced daily. No matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you endured, your growth would never be acknowledged on your own terms. Yet even within this system, the human need for identity did not disappear. Many enslaved men sought meaning and dignity through relationships, family bonds, and quiet acts of self-definition. They courted, formed partnerships, and imagined futures, even when the world around them refused to recognize their adulthood. These efforts were not signs of acceptance but acts of resistance, small, fragile assertions of self in a space designed to erase it. Understanding this aspect of slavery reveals how deeply control extended beyond physical confinement. It shows that domination was not only enforced through force but through the careful manipulation of identity itself. By denying black men the outward recognition of adulthood, slaveholders weakened their social standing and attempted to fracture their sense of self, ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of those who defined the rules. What survived, despite this, was not submission, but a quiet resilience that history is only beginning to fully acknowledge. What the plantation system perfected over time was not only control of the body, but domination of the mind. Once identity had been weakened through prolonged infantilization, psychological pressure filled the space left behind. Physical punishment was visible and immediate, but it was the quieter, constant tactics that often proved more effective. Shame, exposure, and deliberate degradation worked together as an invisible cage, shaping behavior long before force was ever required. Public visibility played a crucial role in this process. Daily life unfolded under watchful eyes, where even the smallest deviation could draw attention. Being singled out, laughed at, or spoken about was enough to remind an individual of his position in the hierarchy. This exposure was not accidental. It reinforced obedience by ensuring that humiliation was not a private experience but a shared one, witnessed and remembered by others. Over time, the fear of being publicly diminished became a powerful deterrent, guiding actions even when no overseer was present. Shame, once introduced, did not need constant reinforcement. It lingered. Enslaved men learned that dignity could be taken away without a single blow, that it could be stripped through words, gestures, and the subtle cues of daily interaction. When someone is repeatedly reminded that he is less than others, that reminder begins to shape how he moves through the world. Resistance becomes riskier not only because of punishment, but because it threatens what little stability remains. Exposure also blurred the boundaries between personal and public life. Privacy, a foundation of personal autonomy, was largely absent. Moments that should have belonged solely to the individual fatigue. Vulnerability, uncertainty were often made visible to others. This constant lack of separation wore down emotional defenses, leaving little room to recover or regroup. In such an environment, even silence became a survival strategy, a way to avoid drawing attention or provoking further scrutiny. Degradation completed the cycle. Through repeated acts of belittlement, enslaved men were encouraged to see themselves through the lens imposed upon them. The system relied on repetition, knowing that a message delivered daily would eventually feel natural. Over time, the external narrative of inferiority risked becoming an internal one, making control more efficient and less reliant on force. When people begin to police themselves, the system has achieved its goal. Yet this psychological warfare was never total. Beneath the surface, many retained an inner awareness that the degradation they experienced was imposed, not earned. This awareness did not always lead to open defiance, but it sustained a quiet resistance rooted in memory, imagination, and hope. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and inner worlds were preserved as places where dignity could survive, even when it was denied publicly. Understanding these psychological strategies helps explain how slavery maintained itself for so long. It was not sustained by violence alone, but by a relentless erosion of self that made resistance costly on every level. By controlling how people saw themselves and how they were seen by others, slaveholders enforced obedience without constant force. Yet the persistence of identity, even under such pressure, stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, revealing that domination of the mind was never as complete as it was intended to be. As psychological control tightened its grip, another layer of suffering unfolded in near total silence. Historical records suggest that some enslaved men were subjected to violations that reached beyond humiliation and labor. Yet these experiences were rarely spoken of, and even more rarely written down. The absence of detailed accounts does not indicate absence of harm. It reveals how deeply stigma and fear shaped what could be remembered publicly, and what had to remain unspoken. Within the plantation system, power was absolute and personal boundaries were fragile. Enslaved men lived in a world where refusal was rarely an option and consent had no recognized meaning. When authority was unchecked, coercion could take forms that left no visible marks, forms that relied on intimidation rather than force, and silence rather than acknowledgement. These experiences were often absorbed into daily life without names, leaving those who endured them with memories they had no language to describe. The social expectations placed on men made this silence heavier. Masculinity in the 19th century was associated with strength, control, and invulnerability. To admit vulnerability was to risk further loss of status, ridicule, or disbelief. For enslaved, whose identities were already undermined by systemic humiliation, speaking about such violations threatened what little sense of self they could protect. Silence became a shield, imperfect but necessary, against further exposure. Historical narratives that do survive often speak indirectly. Writers hinted at inappropriate closeness, a power exercised in ways that crossed unspoken lines, at fear that lingered long after specific events had passed. These references appear between the lines of memoirs and letters, framed carefully to avoid explicit detail. The language reflects the limits of what could be said, not the limits of what occurred. In many cases, the absence of description tells its own story, pointing to experiences that were too dangerous or too painful to articulate openly. The structure of record-keeping further contributed to this erasure. Many enslaved people could not write their own accounts, relying instead on others to document their stories. This dependence shaped what was recorded and what was filtered out. Those collecting testimonies often guided conversations, consciously or unconsciously steering them away from topics considered uncomfortable or inappropriate. As a result, entire categories of suffering were reduced to implication or omitted altogether. Despite this silence, the impact of these experiences can be traced through patterns of behavior and emotional withdrawal described in surviving narratives. Sudden changes in demeanor, deep mistrust, and a guarded approach to relationships hint at injuries that were not physical alone. These responses align with what modern understanding recognizes as trauma. Even when historical sources lack the vocabulary to name it, the effects lingered not only within individuals but within communities, shaping how trust, intimacy, and vulnerability were negotiated long after the events themselves. Placing these experiences within the broader context of slavery reveals how complete control was maintained. Psychological domination, public humiliation, and coercion were not isolated strategies. They reinforced one another. When a system teaches people that their bodies and identities are not their own, it creates conditions where violations can occur without acknowledgement. Silence, in this sense, was not accidental but produced by design. Recognizing this hidden history does not diminish other well-documented forms of suffering. It deepens the understanding of how far-reaching the system truly was. It reminds us that what is missing from the historical record can be as revealing as what remains. By acknowledging the gaps, we begin to see the full human cost of slavery, including the pain that could not be safely spoken, and the endurance of those who carried it forward without words. The silence surrounding these experiences did not happen by chance. It was produced by a convergence of forces that shaped what could be spoken and what had to remain hidden. Shame stood at the center of this silence, reinforced by social expectations and cultural norms that left little room for men to acknowledge vulnerability. For enslaved, whose identities were already under constant threat, admitting to experiences that challenged dominant ideas of strength and control carried the risk of further humiliation. Silence often felt safer than exposure, even when it came at the cost of erasing one's own suffering from history. Illiteracy deepened this erasure. Most enslaved people were denied formal education, cutting them off from the primary means of recording personal experience. Their stories survived largely through oral testimony, shaped by memory and filtered through the circumstances in which they were told. When these accounts were eventually documented, they were often mediated by interviewers, editors, or abolitionists who decided, consciously or not, which details were appropriate to preserve. Topics that unsettled audiences or challenged social norms were frequently softened or omitted, leaving behind narratives that hinted at pain without fully revealing its source. The absence of language further constrained what could be expressed. Terms commonly used today to describe violation, consent, or trauma did not exist in the same way in earlier centuries. Without shared vocabulary, experiences that caused deep harm could be difficult to articulate, even to oneself. Enslaved men navigating these realities often lacked the words to name what had happened, and without names, experiences risked being dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstood entirely. This linguistic gap contributed to a historical record filled with silence and implication rather than clarity. Cultural taboos amplified these barriers. Discussions of sexuality were tightly regulated in 19th-century society, particularly when they involved men. Acknowledging such experiences risked social condemnation or disbelief, both from those within the enslaved community and from the broader public. For men already positioned at the margins of society, breaking these taboos could bring additional danger. The safest path often lay in avoidance, allowing painful memories to remain unspoken rather than risking further harm. These factors work together to produce a pattern of underdocumentation that has shaped how history is understood. When later generations look back at the surviving records, the lack of explicit accounts was sometimes misread as evidence that certain forms of abuse were rare or non-existent. In reality, the silence reflected the conditions under which the records were created, not the absence of suffering. What was left unsaid became a shadow history, present in fragments, pauses, and carefully chosen words. Yet even within these constraints, traces remain. Careful reading of narratives reveals moments where storytellers hesitate, shift focus, or speak in coded language. These moments suggest boundaries they could not cross openly. Modern scholarship has begun to recognize these patterns, understanding that absence itself can be meaningful. By examining what is missing and asking why, historians can begin to reconstruct experiences that were systematically pushed out of view. Placing this silence alongside the psychological and social pressures already described reveals how comprehensive the system of control truly was. It not only inflicted harm but shaped how that harm could be remembered. The under-documentation of these experiences is not a failure of those who endured them. It is evidence of the constraints imposed upon them. Acknowledging this helps restore complexity to the historical record and honors the resilience of individuals who carried their stories forward, even when the world was not ready or willing to hear them. Despite the many gaps left by silence and erasure, certain voices have endured, offering rare windows into the inner workings of slavery and the methods used to control those trapped within it. When read carefully and placed beside one another, the accounts of Frederick Douglass, O Laude Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and the meticulous records kept in plantation journals reveal a consistent pattern. They show that the weakening of identity and the exploitation of vulnerability were not isolated abuses, but practices woven into the fabric of the system itself. Frederick Douglass's writings expose how control extended beyond labor and punishment into the realm of personal dignity. His descriptions of forced exposure, isolation, and the calculated breaking of spirit illustrate a world in which domination required more than physical force. Even when he chose his words cautiously, the emotional weight of his experiences is unmistakable. Moments of restraint, where details are implied rather than stated, suggest boundaries imposed by both personal safety and the expectations of his audience. Yet these silences speak volumes, hinting at violations that went beyond what could be safely described in print. Olaudah Equiano's narrative, written decades earlier, reflects a different stage of the institution but reveals similar dynamics. His recollections of dependency, closeness shaped by unequal power, and confusion over intentions demonstrate how vulnerability could be exploited even in the absence of overt brutality. Equiano's tone often blends gratitude with unease, a combination that underscores how kindness and control could coexist within the same relationship. His account illustrates how exploitation did not always announce itself through violence, but could emerge through blurred boundaries enforced by circumstance. Harriet Jacobs adds another layer by documenting the environment in which these abuses occurred. While her narrative centers on her own experiences, her observations of male enslaved individuals offer insight into the broader culture of domination. She describes households where control was absolute and unpredictability ruled, creating conditions in which violations could occur without challenge. Through her careful language, Jacobs conveys the fear and helplessness that permeated these spaces, emphasizing how power operated behind closed doors as well as in public view. Plantation journals, often written without concern for moral judgment, provide a stark counterpoint to personal narratives. Their detached tone reveals how acts that caused profound suffering were recorded as routine events. Entries noting punishments, surveillance, or intimate access to enslaved individuals demonstrate how deeply normalized control over bodies had become. In these records, the absence of empathy is itself revealing, showing how exploitation was embedded in daily management rather than treated as an exception. Taken together, these sources form a mosaic of experience. Each account alone offers only a partial view, shaped by perspective, risk, and restraint. When combined, they reveal a system that relied on the erosion of autonomy and the exploitation of vulnerability to sustain itself. The repetition of similar patterns across time, place, and authorship challenges any notion that such abuses were rare or incidental. Instead, they appear as recurring features of an institution built on total control. By tracing these connections, it becomes clear that slavery functioned as more than an economic system. It was a social order that demanded submission on every level. Identity, dignity, and personal boundaries were treated as resources to be managed and manipulated. The voices that survived, whether through memoirs or records, do more than recount individual suffering. They expose the underlying logic of a system that required the constant reformation of power, reminding us that the true history of slavery lies not only in what was done openly, but in what was carefully concealed. As we reflect on the stories and accounts of black male slaves, it becomes clear that the traumas they endured were not confined to the fields or the walls of plantations. They reached deep into the very core of identity, shaping how generations understood manhood, strength, and self-worth. The systematic emasculation, the psychological manipulations, the public humiliations, and the hidden violations left scars that could not simply be erased with the end of slavery. These experiences undermined the social recognition of black men as fully human and fully male, creating wounds that echoed far beyond the lifetimes of those who directly suffered. In families and communities, The legacy of this trauma continued to influence behavior, relationships, and perceptions. The enforced suppression of autonomy and dignity, combined with repeated exposure to humiliation and abuse, fostered an environment where trust and self-expression were constantly tested. Generations later, descendants of enslaved men inherited not only the cultural memories of resilience but also the subtle, often unspoken, burdens of coping with identities shaped under oppression. Concepts of masculinity, strength, and vulnerability were filtered through these historical wounds, making the work of understanding and healing both personal and communal. Yet, amid this heavy history, there is also a profound story of resistance and endurance. The men who survived slavery, and the communities that grew from their perseverance, carried forward resilience in countless ways. They sang songs of hope and defiance, nurtured families under impossible conditions, and preserved traditions, stories, and lessons that ensured survival and cultural continuity. These acts of resilience remind us that trauma, while enduring, does not erase agency or humanity. Instead, it can coexist with courage, dignity, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. By bringing these stories to light, we honor both the suffering and the strength of black male slaves, recognizing the complex layers of history that shaped not only their lives but the lives of generations that followed. Understanding this legacy is essential to appreciating the depth of African American history, the resilience embedded within it, and the work that remains to challenge lingering impacts of oppression in modern society. The experiences of these men are not just historical footnotes, they are foundational narratives that inform identity, community, and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this often overlooked aspect of history. By exploring these difficult truths together, we can better understand the resilience of those who came before us and the importance of preserving their stories. If this video helped you see a new perspective, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with your friends and family. Every action helps keep these vital stories alive, ensuring that the lessons of the past continue to guide and inspire us today.